What if I told you that Mercedes didn't lose performance in Japan, but rather sabotaged itself just when Ferrari found the key to turning the entire season around? Because while everyone was looking at the final result, no one saw the mistake that changed everything, an internal failure that exposed Mercedes' greatest weakness in the middle of the race, and that could now open the door to a radical turn in the championship. The question is, are we facing the beginning of Mercedes' fall, or the exact moment in which Ferrari begins to take control? Mercedes left the Japanese Grand Prix with a result that, at first glance, could deceive anyone because on paper they continue to score important points, they remain positioned in the fight and maintain that image of a solid team that they have carried since the beginning of the season. But when you start to dig a little deeper, what appears is not dominance, it is fragility. It is a set of internal errors that reveal that the team does not have total control of its own car at the most delicate moment of the championship. What happened to George Russell was not a normal race incident. It was not pressure from a rival or tire wear, it was something much more serious. A failure in the electrical system caused by a bug in the software that completely altered the power delivery at a key moment, transforming what should have been a strategic advantage into a brutal disadvantage that caused him to lose position on the track. And this is not a minor detail because we are talking about the heart of the current. Regulations, hybrid management, the point where much of the performance is decided in this new era of Formula One. This makes a very clear and very worrying reading. Mercedes not only depends on having a fast car, it depends on executing extremely complex systems perfectly, and in Japan they failed right there, in the place where you cannot afford to fail if you want to fight for a championship, because a software error is not a question of pace, it is a question of control, and when you lose control, you lose the ability to react to what happens in the race. But the problem does not begin or end with that bug because Russell was already conditioned from before with a classification compromised by changes in the rear suspension that did not work as expected, forcing him to compete with a car outside his optimal window, which turns the entire weekend into a chain of decisions that did not work, and that is what really begins to set off the alarms within the team. This is where the narrative changes completely because Mercedes is no longer that team that executes everything perfectly while the others make mistakes. Now it is a team that also fails, that also makes mistakes in technical decisions, in configuration and race execution, and that breaks one of its greatest historical strengths, consistency. And while Mercedes grapples with these internal issues, there is an element that is starting to gain more and more weight in the paddock, a growing sense that the competitive balance is starting to shift, because when a dominant team shows weaknesses, it inevitably opens the door for others to start closing in, pushing, and eventually overtaking. This is the exact point where it stops being an anecdote and begins to become a trend, because what happened in Japan is not just an isolated mistake, it is a sign that Mercedes is entering a phase where every detail counts, where every failure counts twice as much and where any rival that is prepared can take advantage of the slightest opportunity to change the course of the season. While Mercedes tries to recompose itself internally, understand what went wrong and how to prevent it from happening again, Ferrari is operating in a completely different dimension because it is not reacting, it is anticipating, and that is what makes this phase of the championship a real turning point, because the new tests they are developing are not simple adjustments, they are the basis of a leap that can alter the competitive order immediately. Ferrari has identified something key that at Mercedes still seems unstable: the ability to control and maximize the performance of the car in real race conditions, not only in simulations or in qualifying, but at the moment where everything is decided, where energy management, aerodynamic balance and mechanical stability have to function as a perfect system, seamless, without errors, just the opposite of what we saw in Japan with Mercedes. And this is where the situation becomes much more dangerous for the Silver Arrows, because while they are correcting errors in their electrical system and trying to regain consistency in their technical decisions, Ferrari is validating solutions, testing configurations that aim directly to exploit those weaknesses, especially on circuits where fast corner efficiency and power delivery make enormous differences. This is no coincidence. Ferrari had already shown signs of growth since the start of the season, even on weekends where the result did not reflect its true potential. But now the difference is that that potential is beginning to take concrete form, beginning to translate into clear technical direction, team confidence, and above all, a feeling within the paddock that they are getting closer to delivering the final blow. The contrast with Mercedes is brutal because one is in the correction phase and the other in the evolution phase. One is reacting to its own problems and the other is building on its strengths. And in Formula One, that difference in momentum is many times more important than the pure performance of the car at a specific moment. Furthermore, there is a factor that amplifies the situation even more, and that is that when a team like Ferrari begins to get its development right, it does so progressively but constantly. Each improvement fits with the next, Each test adds valuable information and each race becomes an opportunity to consolidate that growth. While Mercedes right now cannot afford that luxury, because each mistake it makes forces it to go back, to rethink, to adjust on the fly. And this brings us to a scenario that just a few races ago seemed unthinkable. Mercedes is no longer in absolute control of the championship. It is no longer setting the pace without opposition. It is now being observed, analyzed, and, most importantly, attacked by a Ferrari that is beginning to understand exactly where it can do damage. Because when an opponent detects your weak point and has the time, resources, and direction to exploit it, the fight stops being balanced and becomes a countdown. And this is where everything converges, where all the pieces begin to fit together and where the situation stops being a simple technical battle and becomes a possible change of era within the season. Because Mercedes no longer only has to solve its mistakes. It has to do it while Ferrari accelerates its development and begins to translate those tests into real performance on the track. The biggest problem for Mercedes right now is not the bug, it is not the suspension, it is not a bad one-off decision. It is the accumulation of all that at a time where they cannot afford to fail, because each race that passes without a clear solution is an opportunity that Ferrari takes advantage of to close the gap, to better understand its car and to position itself as a real, not a theoretical, threat. And the most critical thing of all is that these types of situations in Formula One tend to escalate very quickly, because when a team enters into a dynamic of internal errors, the pressure increases, the decisions become more aggressive, the changes more constant, and that often generates even more instability, exactly the opposite of what you need when you are fighting for a championship. Meanwhile, Ferrari is building just the opposite: stability, confidence, and a coherent development line that is starting to pay off. And when that happens, performance doesn't come all at once, but it comes inevitably, race after race, weekend after weekend, until suddenly it's no longer a surprise. It's the new reality. This puts Mercedes in an extremely delicate position because it no longer depends solely on itself. It now also depends on how quickly Ferrari can turn those tests into a tangible advantage. And if that happens in the next few races, then the margin that seemed sufficient at the beginning of the season may disappear much faster than anyone expected. Formula One is very clear about something: championships are not always lost by those who are slower. Many times they are lost by those who start making mistakes at the wrong time, and Mercedes is dangerously entering that zone. An area where each failure weighs more, where each decision has greater consequences, and where any well-prepared rival can change everything in a matter of weeks. And Ferrari is exactly at that point. So now the big question is no longer whether Mercedes is fast or whether Ferrari can catch them. The real question is how much time Mercedes has left before everything we saw in Japan stops being a warning and becomes the real start of its fall in the championship. Mercedes is at a critical point in the season, a point where it is no longer enough to be fast, where it is no longer enough to have potential, because what has been exposed after Japan is something much deeper. They do not have full control of their own performance, and in modern Formula One that is a silent sentence that sooner or later is paid on the track. The error in the electrical system was not just a technical failure, it was a sign, a clear warning that even in the areas where they should be strongest they are showing cracks. And when those cracks appear in the middle of the fight for the championship, the margin for error completely disappears, forcing the team to compete under constant pressure with no room for error. At the same time, Ferrari represents the complete opposite at this moment, a team that has been growing, that has identified the correct path, and that is transforming its tests into a real threat, one that does not depend on other people's mistakes, but on its own evolution. And that is the most dangerous combination that any rival can face. Because when one team fails and the other advances, the change in balance is not progressive. It is inevitable. Mercedes right now is not only fighting to win races, it is fighting to regain stability, to trust again in its decisions, in its car, in its execution, and that is a much more complex battle than simply finding a few tenths on the track, because it involves rebuilding a base that in Japan was clearly compromised. And meanwhile, Ferrari is getting closer, not as a future threat, but as an immediate reality that can explode at any moment if Mercedes does not react in time. So it all comes down to a very clear idea. Japan was not an accident. It was a warning. A warning that Mercedes no longer has absolute control, and that Ferrari is ready to take it away. Let me know in the comments what you think about all this.